welcome everyone to the latest webinar with Adapty. I'm Ben Golke, a developer advocate here, and I've got a very special guest, Lorenzo Pacanini. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Ben.
Of
Pleasure.
course. So, Lorenzo's from ScaleBay, and the topic today is going to be about how to avoid App Store rejections, and that's going to include both for the Apple App Store and also Google Play. We've got some advice and some different sort of tips to share about how to hopefully get your app approved on the first try. There's no guarantees, of course, but there are various tips and techniques that you can employ to ensure that you have the highest confidence of being able to get approved either on the first or maybe the second, but quickly within that process. You don't have to wait a super long time. So the way that we're going to do this is we're going to go through a couple different kind of sections of sort of the life cycle of an app's development. And the first section is going to be about building your app. So we're going to approach this from kind of from start to finish, right? What are the things that you can do while you're building, while you're preparing for the app to be submitted to the store and then goes live. So this first section is about building your app. And we're going to kind of go through this in sections. So we're going to cover Apple, then we're going to cover Google, and then we'll cover some tips that are kind of helpful for both platforms. So Lorenzo, as far as Apple concerns around building your app, probably the biggest issue here would be not using Apple's in-app purchase system if you're selling digital goods. So let's talk about sort of why that's not allowed or not a good idea and what you should do to ensure that you're complying.
Yes, it is. It is indeed. And of course, it's. I think everybody considers like a very good opportunity the idea of sneaking around the fee that Apple is taking from the in-app payment and everything because it's extra
Right.
revenue for the company, of course.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, Apple doesn't like that, and they don't want you to do that. Unless in very particular environment, for example, in Europe, using only DMA compliant technique, Apple is very rigid and creates a lot of problems anytime someone attempts to do that. We are at Scalebay, we're a growth advisor, and we saw many cases where like a company managed to have some like flow that was a bit tricking the Apple system and was managing to pass their barrier to get the fee. But this, anyway, even if it works, is not a good idea because what happens after is that you as a developer become stuck and you're afraid of submitting a new version or doing an update because it could put at risk your whole business model. So especially in designing your app apart and in thinking what you want to do with your app and how you want to monetize, think about it very carefully because even if you decide to do and to pursue this way, you will risk that in the future you will delay a lot every new version that you will want to release.
Yeah, very, very good advice, I think. Not only are you, like you said, sort of risking the wrath of Apple in general, right? And you're afraid to make updates and stuff, but also the real risk here is rejection, of course. They pull your app from the store, and the really scary one is they revoke your developer certification, which means that your developer account can no longer publish apps in the App Store at all. And so that would actually ruin not only the app we're talking about, but if you have multiple apps, it suddenly means that none of them are available. So the risk is quite high on not doing what Apple wants. Okay, so the next one is really around what we would call like web view based apps. So it's an application that is a native app in the App Store, but it is mostly built with web technology. And so what are some of the things that you found that really you want to make sure that you focus on with web view based apps that you're putting in the store to ensure that Apple will accept the app?
Well, the first advice I will give actually to the audience is to think before if you actually need an application, because many times I speak with people that they do not really need to create an app, but they want to create an app because everybody's doing an app and everything. And doing everything on the web, it's easier and more accessible and generates less problems. But if you do want to create an app and you want to be live in iOS, It's very important that like your app is not just like a website translated inside an app, but it really integrates with the Apple ecosystem. So the best way to avoid the kind of problems related of being only a web view translated into an app is by integrating with the camera function, with the iCloud function, using all their new technology, especially when Apple release a new functionality, a new like ecosystem app and so on. It's good to integrate it inside, as it was at the time, I don't know, with the Apple Watch, creating also the Apple Watch variant to make sure that the users can enjoy your app in the whole ecosystem. So using all the kind of technical elements helps a lot avoid this kind of problems with Apple from my experience.
Yeah, that's all very good advice. I think it's not only is it the case that is it good to include those things, but sometimes if you actually can ride the wave of a new feature showing up on the platform and you implement it, Apple might even promote your app in a way that is more than what they typically would do, right? They could put you on a featured list or something. So it's generally a great idea to keep an eye on those trends and try and include them where it makes sense, right? Don't force it. Don't add something that
Yeah.
the app doesn't need. But when it makes sense, it can be pretty helpful. So then another kind of big one, other than like the whole trying to skirt Apple's, in-app purchase compliance, another really important one that Apple will definitely reject you for is presenting like misleading or illegal content, or content that they deem inappropriate. So, what are your tips around kind of, making sure that you comply with basically the content moderation rules that Apple enforces?
Well, here it's tricky because it's not only about the Apple policy itself, but it's also what if something is illegal in a country and like the government doesn't want you to use it. So here, first you need to understand that Apple wants to have a safe environment for everybody, like a family-friendly environment where there is no harmful or violent or illegal content accessible or at least easy accessible. But at the same time, there are like particular situations where in certain countries, maybe the government is asking Apple not to promote a certain news or certain things and so on, and Apple will have to respect that. So make always sure that you are making Apple happy in the family-friendly way that they want, but as well as you comply with all the legal terms of the country that you want to operate in.
Yeah, that's something that I think maybe developers don't maybe initially they don't you don't think of it necessarily because oftentimes especially if you're a smaller developer, you're building an app, you're putting it in the store, and you're going into the country selector, and maybe you're just saying select all, right? I want my app to be available as widely as possible, and that is generally speaking a good thing. But the concern around that is, like you said, right? Countries can all have very different rules and laws, and
Yeah.
it isn't up to Apple necessarily to make sure that you are complying with all those. It's up to you as the provider of a business in a particular country. So it is ultimately your responsibility to check those things. Okay, so we got a couple sort of smaller ones that we'll kind of breeze through here. So one is make sure that if you're using iCloud, like in your app, you're utilizing space in iCloud, particularly space that belongs to that user. Be careful around how you do that. Make sure that you're accessing that data correctly and you're putting data in the right place. Improperly using that can cause Apple to reject you. It's kind of perhaps a subtle one, but it's one that, in the technical process that can hurt you. And then also keep an eye on your IPA binary. So that's the file that gets created. It's the bundle that actually gets of all the code and all your resources that gets submitted to Apple for approval. Make sure that that is under 4 GB. That's just a hard rule that Apple has. They won't accept IPA files that are larger than that. So keep an eye on that. It can be when you're adding images and resources and things, it can be fun to add all these cool things, but it can also balloon the size of your app. So just be aware that you don't get over that size. Um, so, what advice do you have for people on, over the last 20 years of building iOS apps, Apple has gone from being what I would say very strict on design principles and standards around how you actually design your UI, and they've gotten more lax, and they've also sort of enforce this rule a little bit subjectively, but in general, Apple has a set of guidelines called the HIG, the Human Interface Guidelines. And so, what have you found about sort of how important is that? How much should you stick to it? How far away can you stray, right, and still sort of get approved?
The best way, of course, is to respect them. This will not only help you with the approval process, but will actually help you also with the users in general, because you notice that in between apps for iOS, like you have many similar functionality, or like I don't know,
Hmm.
paywall are working more or less in the same ways, or like the buttons are done in a certain way. So by respecting these standards, you're not only respecting what Apple rules are, but you are also engaging in a more familiar language with the users. If you try to design an app that is completely different from all the other iOS apps that you see in the market, you will not only face the barrier of Apple, but also of the users of getting used to it. So overall, we always recommend to adhere to these standards as much as possible, of course, also to avoid the rejection problems, but as well as the user engagement.
Right. Yeah, I think with design sometimes you can get sort of excited by, oh, a new different design challenge that
Yeah.
I can tackle, right? And it's fun while you're doing it, but the downside is that, you don't have that training, you don't have that kind of built-in familiarity, which depending on your audience could either be sort of a neutral thing or more than likely it's probably a net negative because they're not going to know how to use your app. Cool. So let's move on to Google Play a little bit. So this is similar to a point that we made with Apple, but Google has its own rules around content guidelines. So what have you found when sort of advising people with Google Apps? How is it the same and how is it maybe different from what Apple requires?
Anyway, it's different because while Apple always have a human testing the different version and builds, Google not always does, and many times serves itself by algorithms, and we look for the words or for what happens in the app via AI. So here you're taking very risky bets by including content that Google might deem inappropriate or harmful for the users, not only inside the app content but also in the text. For example, in my career, I saw a very strong change in organic traffic for a shooting game. And Google doesn't want and wants shooting games. Of course, now it's borderline because it brings a lot of money, but of course it's a violent content. And
Right.
eventually, one month they decided to penalize this app, and like all the organic went away. So when thinking about an app, take into consideration that even if it's something super appealing to users, or where you have a big niche such as shooting games or like more violent kind of games, think that this could create a problem in getting the app approved.
And sort of by extension, even if it does get approved, like you said, sometimes it can be in the store and then Google decides, well, we don't like this anymore, so
Yes.
we're going to delist the keywords that make that rank highly, right? And then
Yeah.
even if the app's available, no one's downloading it because they can't find it. So uh, skirt these rules at your own risk, I think is the bottom line there.
Yeah. The bottom line.
So moving on to some concerns that really affect both platforms that are kind of universal to developing an app in general. Um, so poor app performance, right? Let's talk about that and what that can do to not just the approval process, but obviously the sort of delight, the surprise and delight that you're trying to create with your users and how that can be affected. So, what are maybe some best practices around ensuring that your app performs well?
Well, the first is extensive testing, of course. It's very important that your app behave as it should behave. So any kind of crash, bug, or glitch or anything that could take the attention of the reviewer, which is testing your app, it puts your app in a high risk position of not getting approved. It can be a crash, it can be a recurring bug, it can be battery used too much from your application because you didn't set it right, it can be everything. So You need to ensure smooth performances and that the app works as it should work. Also, I read a stat once that was that 8% of apps were refused due to exhibit bugs. So, like a lot of people are submitting apps or new builds, but they get refused only because there is a bug. It can be a login bug or something else, but can cause a big loss of time.
You're not going to be able to catch everything, right? I mean, software's never finished. It's a constant iterative process, but certainly you're not doing yourself any favors by rushing the necessarily the build of your app, getting it submitted. If it does have lots of obvious bugs, Apple's just going to immediately reject it, and
Yeah.
you won't really have. It'll be a kind of all for naught. So definitely a good idea to make sure that that you've tested it as best you can, basically, right, with the resources that you have. Um, Cool. Another one would be like just kind of also be wary, even if the app doesn't crash or doesn't have obvious bugs, if it's using things too much, right? If it's a resource hog, so
Yeah.
let's say it's overly draining the battery or it's using up way too much memory or something, that can be something that also Apple looks for and they will reject you because you're not. I call that sort of being a good citizen on the ecosystem within the platform, right? Like you are one app among many on the iPhone or the device, and you want to sort of play nice with everyone, make sure that your app gets along with with other apps, which includes not just taking every resource you can, but being careful with that. Cool. So a couple other ones to kind of to pay attention to. Let's jump to compatibility and performance. Right, we talked about sort of general performance on make sure your app's not buggy and it doesn't crash. So as far as you submitted it and it's approved and it's working, but then Apple updates their operating system. What are some things that you want to make sure you keep an eye on with that? Even though maybe you have an app already in the store, how do you sort of respond to things like platform changes?
Platform changes, it's something you cannot really forecast. Let's say, like you have announcement, but you do not really know what change in the code until it happens and so on. So the best way is
Sure.
to read, to talk with your peers, understand what is the new thing that can be used, and especially the new technical functionality that your app can take advantage on. So the best way is understanding all the small little details and fine prints of the platform change and integrate it.
Great. And as far as something a little bit more on the business side, on the maybe the legal side, as a last concern around both platforms for developing your app, uh, beware of copyright laws, both in the United States if you're targeting that, or other countries. They're not necessarily the same rules, and even other things about just sort of rights to the IP. Right, make sure that you're not, for example, building an app that's got a bunch of Disney characters in it. If you're not working for Disney, things like that. Those can be either concerns that Apple will catch or Google will catch during the approval process, or they don't, and then you get in trouble later because let's say Disney or whoever it is finds your application and gives you problems. So be wary of those. Don't just take. Be wary of those concerns and be respectful of other people's intellectual property.
And
Awesome.
let me add, Ben, on
Yeah,
this point, because sometimes it's a thing that teams overlook, especially during like merger and acquisition situations. This can become a real problem. Even though, for example, you as a company acquired a developer and everything is done and you paid and you have the ownership and everything, for Apple especially, it's not that easy to acknowledge that now your brand is the one of the ones you bought. So usually in this situation, they require extensive documentation, which if you do not have ready, because I don't know, it's all spread around, it's important to have because adding your own brand name to an app that it wasn't yours before a purchase can cause some issues.
very fair. And it's, I think, probably becoming more of a concern with developers selling apps to other developers and things like that,
Yeah.
right? It's becoming more common that M&A, mergers and acquisitions, can even in small teams, right, or even indies. I've seen indie developers buy other people's apps. So even though you're not a big company, you can still be affected by these things. So let's move on to let's assume here you've built your app, you've carefully tested it, you've made sure that you're complying as best you can with all of the rules and regulations that you know about, and you're getting ready to actually submit your app to Apple or Google for approval in the store. And so the coding is hopefully done, and now it's more about metadata creation and marketing materials and things like that that you're preparing to bring your app live in production. So as far as Apple specific concerns, um, what are some things that maybe let's talk about like the top rejection reason, right? The reason that you might get
Yeah.
rejected that doesn't have anything to do with the app binary. So it's not buggy, it's not crashing, nothing like that. It's something with the submission itself.
Yeah.
What's that?
The top reason, like above the bugs for which apps get rejected on the Apple Store, is actually more information needed. Like four words that ask more information.
Right.
Usually, this case, it's very easy to solve, and like people underestimate it when submitting their build. It requires the developer to explain clearly the feature and how the app works, what you want the tester to do to see the value of your app. And it can easily be done with a very clear explanation, like, okay, my app is this. You can log in clicking this button. You need to use this user and this password. Then you can click here and you can have access to, I don't know, the content that you are promoting in your app. And like by doing a very step-by-step and easy guide, you avoid this rejection reason. As well, it can help like to add a video, for example, of the use case, of the user usage of the feature. And this can help a lot to avoid the more information needed. Usually, this is a good news because you can just reply with more information, explaining very well what the tester
Right.
has to do, and you solve
Right.
it. But it's important.
Yeah, I feel if you're an Apple platform developer and you've ever submitted an app to the App Store, you probably have seen this rejection. It's extremely
Yes.
common. Uh, to give a little anecdote of personal experience, in 2021, I was managing a team that was building an app, and we were putting it in the store for the first time. It was the 1.0 release, and it was an app designed for law enforcement in the United States. So, there's a lot of police officers in the United States who could use the app, but it is, by comparison to the entire App Store, a fairly niche sort of industry
Yeah.
and application. And because it was designed for police officers, Apple took very strong interest in the content and what we were doing and the functionality. And it was a little bit strange that the functionality was not something that would be easily testable by Apple. So we got rejected, I believe, 6 times, and most of them were this rejection. The more information needed.
More
The thing I
information needed.
found frustrating was that they would ask a question in the rejection, and we would prepare an answer, submit it again, and they would say, "Okay, fine, that question is answered. Now we have another question." And so that at the time, I just maybe got unlucky with my reviewer, but what I did and what you've described here is very apropos because it was a little bit niche and because it was something that was somewhat non-standard. What I did in the end, aside from a bunch of other sort of just like legal documentation they want us to provide, I also gave them a sort of tutorial screenshot text-based walkthrough of the application, like 3 or 4 pages with pictures and
Yeah.
descriptions. And I also made a video, a screen capture video of me using the application and then verbally explaining how it works. So those two assets, the video and the text with the screenshots, I think really helped them understand the functionality of what we were doing, and that ultimately led to them again sending
Approve
the
it.
other docs they wanted. Once I gave them the docs and all
Yeah.
this other explanation, like, okay, cool, this works. We're good. You are approved. And then after that, I don't think we had a single rejection with any updates because they understood what we were doing. But it's very important if it's not just sort of adding data or taking pictures or sort of normal type app things as far as functionality, you do want to make sure, maybe even learn from me and maybe be proactive, maybe create the video before you even submit the first time and just add the video to the submission the very first time as a precaution. And maybe you'll get approved without all that back and forth.
Yes. Yeah. It can take a lot of
Cool.
time.
So as far as just a small thing around the submission with Apple, Apple doesn't like the words beta, test, demo, anything like that in an actual submission of descriptions or any metadata. They don't want to see it on the app icon or in the title or anything like that. That implies that the app isn't finished. And so if you use those terms during your testing period, totally fine. Just make sure that you take them out before you submit. As far as Google, so Google has some very specific rules around data handling. So what are the things that you want to kind of be in mindful of when you're submitting to Google Play around data handling?
For Google, especially as we said, chances are that you're being tested from an AI and everything. The first thing they usually look is your policy and like how you're handling the data. So make sure that your privacy policy and the data management it's very clear, it's very accessible. You can find it like maximum after 2 clicks from where you are, both on the web or in the app, and this will avoid a lot of Google rejections. Of course, it's important also in Apple, but on Google, from my experience, more rejection come from this.
That's really good advice and something that might be easily overlooked, particularly if the team is mostly like dev focused. You might not remember that that's a super important thing. So yeah,
Yeah.
keep that in mind. So as far as we talked about Apple being very sort of finicky about things like beta and test and demo. Are there words that Google doesn't like, that doesn't want you to use in in your promotional materials?
Yeah, mainly related to the Android brand. So they do not want you to use Android. Like even if your app is for Android, you cannot put in your name of the app. I don't know, app one Android because yeah, that will get
Right.
rejected for sure.
Cool. Which is probably most like a trademark thing, right? They're trying to defend their trademark, so it makes sense. But just kind of be mindful of that don't do it. You'll just get rejected. So as far as some concerns that affect both platforms that are around the submission, we talked a little about data handling. So that's a very important concern for Google. It is also for Apple, but Google seems to really be super. They really harp on that. As far as user privacy protection and stuff, um, maybe what are the differences that you've seen like with Apple and Google around like the privacy policy and other like Apple has the I'm forgetting the name, but the app nutrition guide, which is really like it tells you
Yeah.
all the things the app's going to access. So what are those differences and similarities there?
In terms of similarities, it is very important that you state what are you using, what are you tracking, and where you're storing it. So this is something that you must share in a transparent way to both Apple and Google. It's good to have it easily available, especially on the web for Google that is using AI to find this kind of documentation. And it has to be clear. So try to avoid sneaky way to explain what you do with the data and everything. Just be straightforward. Usually people do not go to read the privacy policy of your app. So
Right.
even if you take a lot of information, shouldn't be a problem.
Right. And you can't even find, I've in the past, because I don't necessarily want to, pay a lawyer to write a huge long document. I've even looked at other public companies' private privacy policies and other apps to sort of get an idea of what they're covering, and a lot of them are very similar, at least in sort of the general structure. So if you are building one yourself and you don't really know how to do that, I would recommend things like, obviously this is not legal advice. Go if you're really concerned about it, go speak to a lawyer. But in general, they follow a very similar structure, and you can use other privacy policies as an example to sort of help build yours. Cool. And then as far as metadata, so there's lots and lots of stuff that you have to submit with both Google and Apple when you're submitting an app. There's not just the app binary that we talked about already. There is the title and the subtitle and the description and the keywords and the screenshots and the promotional video and there's a whole ton of stuff that you're required to provide. And then depending on the category, there's even things that I've seen like Apple do where they ask you for certain data for certain countries. So like if you're going to put this app in a certain country, it wants, and in a particular, it's like in the kids category, it's in the games category. They want to see some additional metadata beyond that. So, what are your general tips around kind of making sure that you get all of that information and you get it in there?
Well, all these that you mentioned, it's called App Store optimization in like ASO, which I believe everybody knows. So me, I did ASO for a lot of apps, and I saw that many developers, especially like small studios that are not familiar with ASO, they underestimate many passages of this process. So of course, like the metadata, all the text on the page have different rules and offer many different opportunities. So, for example, of course, in the title, the use of competitions or like competitor name or like other platform is not allowed neither on Google or Apple. But this space offer a unique opportunity for you to become visible on these keywords, especially on very niche keywords. So it's very important to give thought about how you want to call, what keywords do you want to use in all this metadata, and to make sure that the description is not, of course, done for a robot, but for a human, and like the tester can easily see the value and understand what's the app about. Apart from this, you mentioned earlier that using Android or using like, I don't know, Google trademark, but as well on Apple using phones that are not iPhones in the screenshots, so for example, can result
Right.
in a rejection. And yeah, so check all these rules. So like on internet, you can find a lot of documentation or talk with an expert, but have a look because they can become very easy to solve reasons for rejections.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think generally speaking, right, it's not a form that you have to fill out and never think of again, right? Don't think of it that way. Think of it as, like you said, uh, each thing has different rules and constraints, but then it also presents different opportunities. So don't just fill it out because it's a task to be done. Consider those things carefully and make sure that you're making good choices so you don't get rejected, and potentially good choices so that your app will rank higher because it is ultimately using the algorithm to promote your application, and that's where it gets most of the information from is from the metadata that you provide. Cool. And then kind of a last thing around submission that is part of that metadata submission. There is on the Apple side, there's a little section at the bottom where you provide notes that aren't going to be public. They're going to go directly to the reviewer. And that includes things like content information, and login and notes. So you have any tips around kind of how to fill that section out well so that hopefully you empower the reviewer with what they need?
Yeah, this is the section that it's your best weapon against the more information needed. So this is exactly
Right.
where you should put your tester information. So what's the login? What's the password? Double check that it works. There are a lot of corner cases where, for example, your app is for a market. Like, I don't know, it can be Italy, but your tester will be in US or somewhere else.
Hmm.
So make sure that the login that you give allows the tester to access the content that you want the users to see. Even though it's for a different market, imagine that like the tester must engage with your app in a natural way as if it's a target user. So even though your tester is not the target, you need to treat him as the target audience, and you need to show how the environment works. And after what we both said before, make sure to explain in a very easy step kind of guide. If you want to spend a bit more time in doing the video, it's really a good investment in explaining where to click, what to do, what to see, because this will ensure that the developer has everything he has to do a proper testing. After, of course, we mentioned many other reasons that this can go wrong, but it's a very good start.
Sure. Right. Yeah, it's something to keep in mind, right? That the app reviewer is, for one thing, not a magic person. They don't have like perfect context or a intimate understanding of how your app works ahead of time. They're discovering and working through your app just like anybody else. So treat them basically like a new user. And then the other thing is, like you said, right, don't assume that they're going to go the extra mile to make sure that they have what they need to test. They're just going to reject your app. If they don't have what they
Yeah.
need, they don't have time. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of apps and updates being submitted every week. They don't have time to chase down some concern. So if you don't give them what they need, they're just going to reject you with more information needed, and then you'll have to go through an entire other cycle of submission. Cool. As far as just some kind of general advice, this is not really something that fits into any of the things that we've done, but just kind of very broadly speaking, what have you found around app scoping? And what I'll just define what that means. So basically, how big of an idea is this, right? Is it something that is super broadly appealing to tons of people? Or is it something that's much more niche, like my example, where, while there are many police officers in the United States, compared to the overall population, they're a very tiny, tiny subset. So it is, in the grand scheme of things, a pretty niche application. What's your advice around kind of, this is something you might want to consider actually at the very beginning when you're deciding what app to build, right? Uh, what have you found that works and doesn't work around kind of deciding the scope of your app?
It depends a lot on the target audience, and it's a very particular case. So I believe not all the companies have this. But your example before fits another example I had in mind is that when you do build something which is for an audience that is too niche or too small, but you want to make it publicly available, you risk rejections. Why? Because the stores they want to offer products for everybody. So everybody should be able to use the product, your product. But what happens when, for example, you are like a big corporation and you want to create an app that only allows your, I don't know, B2B software client to log in and to manage a certain aspect of it? This can be a problem because you're not speaking to everybody, which is the target of the Apple Store. You're speaking only with a certain subset of customers. So whenever you have this kind of super niche situation, and it's mostly the case of B2B software companies that want to have an app for certain reason, make sure that you offer something accessible to the general public. For example, maybe all the B2B clients can log in and can do things, but make sure that, for example, someone which is not your client can create an account or can see information about your company. It can be something as easy as that that can transform an app from being too niche to the eye of the tester, an app which can have information useful for everybody. Then, of course, your target will be the niche. And in terms of the other way around in the example, so from too niche to overly exaggerated, you risk two things. The first is nobody likes copycat, and copycats not always work. So, like doing something super generic just because there is a successful app doing it since long time doesn't mean that Apple will approve you. Actually, probably they will not because you do not bring anything innovative. You're not doing something with a purpose, and your app is not solving like a real problem. So you need to a bit yeah, watch out from copy something that works for everybody just because it's a very big potential for building something for an audience which is too small. And in the end, there is one last variant that sometimes it happens. And this I read it online. Is the story of like a hand washing application during the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and the Apple was constantly getting rejected because Apple was developing their own software about it in the Apple Watch and everything. Like the developers were
Right.
like submitting
Right.
over and over, but
Yeah.
Apple blocked it.
Yeah, definitely. I think an unwritten rule in Apple's review guidelines is don't build things that we have built or we are going to build because we will probably
Yeah.
reject you. And you maybe not you won't even know why until 6 months from now. You're like, oh, they just released an app or an update to the operating system that includes the functionality that I was going to create. That's not necessarily fair, but that is how they operate. I think as far as something that's too niche, just as a workaround that some people in the audience could try, if it's not really not working for you to have the app be in the App Store. I'm going to talk about Apple for a second, but it really applies to Google as well. Is you could do either enterprise distribution. They have a different way that you can distribute apps. It's generally speaking for within an organization. So if you're building like an application for a company's employees and there's thousands and thousands of employees, it's a large population, but it's still way too niche for the App Store. So there's a way to do it to distribute it that way. And they also, this is I think a couple of years ago, they launched a way for you to basically put the app in the App Store, but have it be unlisted. So it's not part of search, it's not part of the algorithm, but it is public in the App Store. It's anybody can get it if they have the direct link to it. So you could, for example, use all the functionality of the App Store. So like the hosting and the updates and the ease of install in someone's device. But the one thing you're missing out on, of course, is the search algorithm and discoverability. But if it is something that you're going to distribute directly to your customers, you that could be still a successful way for you to kind of harness most of the power, but not sort of be rejected because the app is too niche for the general population. Cool. Any sort of parting thoughts around sort of tips or tricks on what to do when maybe what's the best thing to do when you get rejected?
Again, depends on the reason and what they say and everything, but what
Yeah.
I would say is just like very easily try it again. So like
Yeah.
if you really do not understand, if you really did everything right, if you
Right.
thought about all the things they mentioned, just try to resubmit and like sometimes they just approve.
Yeah, sometimes you can submit with no changes and it'll go from being rejected to being approved. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
it
when in doubt,
happens.
try it again. Awesome. Well, thank you, Lorenzo, so much for joining us and for providing all this really great advice. I think I've definitely learned a few things, and I think if people were to follow these tips, my guess would be that they would see at least fewer rejections. Maybe hopefully zero rejections. So, thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thank you, Ben, for having me.
Sure. So let's take a look at the questions. We don't have any questions in the chat or the Q&A section. So please, the audience that's here, we do have a couple of minutes. Feel free to submit questions if you have any for Lorenzo or me. And also, if you'd prefer to just say your question, you can also raise your hand and we can go ahead and unmute you and you can just talk directly. So we do have a question in the chat. About 6 months ago, we launched a new app in the App Store. When we had enough organic traffic, we integrated monetization, and during the app update, we received guideline 4.3a design spam. How can we resolve this?
It's a very specific case. I don't know if you have, Katerina, more context and everything, but of course, integrating monetization is a process that changes the nature of the app. So not only in generating revenues for the developer, of course, but it changes the user experience. So like an app that was serving a purpose and so on, suddenly as can be an abuse of monetization. So too many ads showing up and everything, and this could cause rejection. So it depends a lot on which kind of monetization you implemented. If it was very aggressive, maybe you could try with a very smooth monetization at first, so not very invasive, reduce the size of the banner, reduce the positions or everything, and then try to resubmit with a less aggressive strategy.
That's good advice. Yeah, maybe back off on the monetization a little bit, right? Like have it be less invasive or do it in stages rather than all at once is good advice. And then Robin writes that they have the same issue with the VPN app. It's been in the store for years, and then suddenly with an update, they're getting rejected for spam. I think in some respects, sometimes that can actually be less an actual violation of something and more maybe a misinterpretation or misunderstanding by the app reviewer. Something important to remember is that the app reviewers are human and they are applying these rules with their own basically subjective opinion. I mean, they're supposed to be as objective as possible, but clearly, no human can be perfectly objective. So they are interpreting and they are then making a judgment call. So without getting super into the specifics of these two apps that were mentioned, we'd have to know more, I think, to help you more sort of very specifically. But in general, it can be the case that sometimes it's not necessarily that you have a spam app. It's that that's how the reviewer has interpreted what they're seeing, and they're rejecting you for a reason they believe to be accurate, but maybe it's not. And this I think would be, I mean, Lorenzo, correct me if you think this is not right, but I would say in this example, this could be one where even though the rejection reason is not information is needed, it could be that providing information to them around what you're doing, if you added monetization or whatever, when you resubmit, could help provide evidence that your app is in fact not spam and it's doing some legitimate business practice that you feel is fine. And then once they have that additional context, they might then agree. Of course, there's no guarantees, but what have you found with kind of try? I'm not advocating you argue with them necessarily, but I am advocating that you advocate for your use case and how have you found that to work?
And yeah, Robin, I would add also that, yeah, of course, like VPN is a very crowded app section. I think is the main source of revenues or almost for Apple. So it's like very, very important and so on.
Yeah.
And all the VPN app more or less they do the same thing, no? Like it's not that
Right.
you reinvent the
Yeah.
wheel, but what
Yeah.
you could try is to set like a super specific feature that maybe is not interest to VPN user that is super random and completely unrelated. And you could try to use these that, I don't know, some VPN that you the keychain or the password, like something like this, and
Yeah.
try to do something specific to show the extra value and not the duplication of another app.
Yeah. Totally fair. Okay. We have another question. I have an issue that my first account was closed because we did not prolong the subscription for the Apple Dev program. We created a second account, provided changes in the app, and Apple rejected us with spam due to app one is not available now, but it is blocked to publish app two. So it sounds like they moved from one dev account to another, and there's concerns with Apple around maybe that you're trying to create like a spam duplicate of the app that's already there or that was available. Um, so that kind of sounds like that sort of feeds into the like issue we talked about before about M&A, right? And this is not an
Yeah.
example where they sold, but they still changed the development environment from one account to the other. Yeah, what have you found with that? How can we get around that?
This usually involve a lot of documentation and discussion with Apple. So, I mean, this is not a classic M&A thing as mentioned before, because I was more referring to the name and everything. Here, if you didn't prolongate the subscription and then you created a second account without trying to talk to Apple and everything, so of course, like the first instinct they did was like, okay, this is something fishy. Why did they create another account? Why they didn't try to solve it? Again, I don't know the context and if you try to speak with them directly, but what I would advise is to speak with them, to share like the documentation, the company documentation, the registered business documentation and everything and say, look, I did it, I didn't renew it and so on. Could you unlock it? And usually if you have everything all right and you didn't do anything bad, they are responsive. So I will try to speak with them in a resolution center way.
That's fair. We have time for one more question. So there is a question in the Q&A from an anonymous person. This person is saying that they would like to submit an app for approval that has iPhone and iPad support, but then later decide to remove the iPad support. If they do that, can they exclude iPad devices from future updates? Um, so I'm not exactly positive if that exact scenario is possible, but in general, I would say that Apple is not going to be super excited about you offering functionality to the customers and then taking it away. So that certainly is, I think, a rejection risk. And then as far as excluding, you'd have to exclude. You'd have no more iPad build of the application, so it wouldn't show up as a native iPad application. But you can still run iPhone apps on the iPad in sort of that shrunken mode. And you'd have to fully exclude them. And I don't think that's actually even possible. So we'd have to check specifically for you. But in general, I think the answer is it's questionable whether you can do what you're suggesting, like technically. And from a subjective perspective, Apple's probably not going to be too happy about you providing functionality and then taking it away. Cool. Okay, so we unfortunately are out of time. So thank you all very much for joining us and for asking some great questions. And thank you once again, Lorenzo, for co-hosting with me and providing lots of, I think, really great advice.
Thank you very much, Ben.
All right, everybody, have a great day. Thank you.